Ladies and gentlemen, we are starting our last session of this wonderful conference on creative arts. And so in our last part we have a number of outstanding scholars and museum curators speaking, and there is very little actually change in the program. So 4:35 p.m. we don't have a tea break. So after the lecture of distinguished Wang Yao, we will have the summary and closing ceremony. Yeah, I hope you are satisfied with that, and I remind all the respective speakers that we have rather close time frame and ask you to speak to the 20 minutes. And now it is a great pleasure for Professor Gang and for myself to announce the first speaker of this session, Chase Robinson, the director of the National Museum of Asian Arts at Fudan University, Washington, D.C., with the lecture on the second century of the National Museum of Asian Art, Museum as a Global Resource. So, Dr. Robinson, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. What a great pleasure it is to be here to join you all for this terribly interesting conference. Of course, I'm grateful to all of those who had a hand in organizing the events of these few days, but in particular Jiao Fang, who's obviously played a crucial role and is a long-standing friend of our museum, with whom I've had the pleasure of speaking recently several times, including on a visit of his to Washington, D.C. So as our moderator announced, I'm the director of an Asian art museum. In fact, I find myself with the great privilege of looking after the National Museum of Asian Art. And that frames my thinking, and that frames, in some respects, my remarks. When I think about what an Asian art museum can and should be, particularly in the 21st century, I consider our own institutional needs. I consider also those needs as they're nested within a larger set of both national and international imperatives. So my presentation is brief. I will try to pay respect to the direction I've been given, and it features three parts. Part one, our past. In May of last year, in May of 2023, the museum celebrated its 100th birthday, our centennial. It was on May 9th, 1923, that the Freer Gallery of Art opened its doors, making good on a promise that our founding father, Charles Lang Freer, had made many years earlier in December of 1906. There is Mr. Freer, and that's as close as Mr. Freer ever gets to a smile. He was a serious man. The promise that he gave in December of 1906 was to donate his collection, unarguably one of the best collections that ever was or ever will be of Asian art, along with very significant financial resources, all in the service of building a museum on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. At the time of its opening, the museum's holdings were largely concentrated in American art of Freer's time, of pre-modern East Asian art, and ancient works from Egypt and the Near East. Now, what we celebrated, I mentioned a moment ago that we celebrated our centennial in 2023. What we celebrated was not just America's first major museum establishing donation. It wasn't even the founding of America's first museum devoted to Asian art. What we celebrated actually was nothing less than the centennial of America's first ever National Art Museum. And it is significant to my thinking that America, in that founding moment, dedicated itself to a national art museum that was specialized in Asian art in particular, but also its connection with American art. In that sense, it's a symbolic expression of an industrializing and internationalizing country, which was then, the turn of the 20th century, very much competing for the global prestige and status that high culture could deliver. The museum that was the kernel of Mr. Freer's collection, 9,500 works, housed in then about 20 galleries, and they were managed initially by a very small group of about a dozen museum professionals. A century later, in 2023, we have grown to a collection 5 times that size, which we display an exhibition space that is about twice the size of the original Freer Gallery. Our collection, as some of you will know, is broad and deep. It ranges from Japan, Korea, China, South and Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East, inclusive of North Africa. Whereas the initial Freer Gallery of Art was housed by a skeleton crew of about a dozen professionals, we now have closer to 150 professionals who, after 10 decades of training and publishing, have really shaped the fields of Islamic and Asian art history, also art conservation, conservation science, and they've done so working in what's become an exhibition research and public programming complex. And this is important, and we're quite proud of this feature, a museum that is free and open 364 days a year. Now, this is an attractive story, the one I've told you so far, a story of professionalization, growth, impact. Still, as true as my words may be, and trust me, they're accurate, and as proud as we can be, those words, it might be said, come a little bit too easily. They sound a little bit self-regarding, a little bit self-congratulatory. Most important, I think they obscure, in a fog of accomplishment, the great challenges that we face, indeed, the great challenges that all museums face. And for that reason, I'll move from this register, if I may, of self-regard and pride to a kind of fog-clearing set of observations and prescriptions. So I move to part 2, critique. Now, were I to write a manifesto of an art museum to be, I would start with something like this. The future of art museums lies less in accumulation than in collaboration, less in leveraging scarcity than increasing access, and less in performing our authority than demystifying museum practice. I'm going to keep the quotation on the slide because I think it's important to my thinking. Let me explain. Founded in the beginning of what became an American century, a century in which the United States of America dominated and imbued with all the confidence of what we call the Gilded Age, the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and 1900, also burnished with the prestige of decades of connoisseurial authority, our museum now finds itself in a very different world. A global order, and I hardly need say this here, but I will all the same. A global order determined mainly by Northern European and North American metropoles has given way to a polycentric world, a world in which cities, especially in East Asia, but also South Asia and the Middle East, have become powerful engines of economic, political, and cultural power. So political truths have been challenged. Political facts that we once took for granted are no longer operable. Other verities, other truths, are also being challenged in North America. Presumptions about the self-evident value of culture in educating and enlightening the public. Truths about the location and role of art museums on what had been, but is no longer, a stable landscape of technology and media. Verities, truths about the neutrality and universality of systems of thought through which knowledge in the museum world was produced. Lots of criticisms have been taking place. In fact, criticisms can and should be made of a certain model of the museum, to quote Charles Lang Freer, as a beautiful place filled with things rare and chosen. The museum as temple of beauty, the museum as storehouse of masterworks, professionalized and routinized in practices that very much concentrate on acquisition and hoarding. Now this model, as it happens, is a secondary model. American museums moved in this direction during the 20s and 30s and 40s. And I think they've lost track of a truth that William Boyd articulated about 25 years ago. We think of museums as places of objects, William Boyd wrote. In fact, they're places of ideas. What do I mean by that? What did Boyd mean by that? What I'd like to argue is that what is distinctive in what I'll loosely call traditional art museums, and certainly would include the one I have the pleasure of looking after, is that their underlying ideologies, which ultimately function to order, to model, to legitimize, to exclude, those are cloaked behind some unexamined discourses of uniqueness, of beauty, of creativity, and more besides. In the case of our museum, we've articulated, I think, especially regularly and proudly, a theory of culture transcending beauty, which, as a universalizing assertion, has functioned to obscure histories that I'll get to in a moment. Allow me to move a little bit from the theoretical to the applied, from observation to practice. During my 5 years as director, we've acquired about 5,000 objects. This spring, for instance, and here's just a small selection of the objects that we've recently acquired, we held an exhibition that explores the Edo period world of ghosts and spirits as filtered through No and Kabuki theater. It's a fantastic exhibition. Do come, pay us a visit. We're very proud of those acquisitions, but I have a little bit, more than a little bit, of ambivalence. Part of the ambivalence derives, and this is a problem that all of us have in museums, through practical considerations. Where do we put all of these objects? How do we look after them? There are any number of practical problems. But there are other theoretical or more philosophical challenges. If the social, and I've already, as it were, hinted at this point that I'm making, if the social, economic, and political forces of the last century, the 20th century, taught us anything, it's that the globe has become radically interdependent. A moment ago, I shared that manifesto. I return to one aspect of it now. One-sided accumulation of capital, power, resources, or objects is, to my thinking, incompatible with the norms, the associations, the relationships upon which we can together build a more sustainable future. Shared and collaborative partnerships, for instance. Transparency and accountability in our practices, for another. Respect, empathy, and celebration of what unites us, but also what makes us different. The museum that I have the pleasure of looking after is on a path of transformation. Let me take you through that transformation, and I'm really moving then from part 2 to part 3, from critique to the future. Now, I could say a great deal about activities that are subverting, that are undermining, but also complementing traditional modes of museum practice. For instance, I could talk about a new installation that anchors objects in the views, the opinions, the experiences of our staff, curators but non-curators, docents, and volunteers. I could talk about exhibitions that decenter curatorial authority, as it were, that complement the traditional modes of museum authority by bringing into the galleries and giving authority to the voices of members of various communities who are part of our, not just our audiences, but the communities to which we belong. We've done 2 shows in which those community voices are written into labels. I could talk about our public festivals, and here the important aspect is that we do not assume that we know how best to produce festivals that will appeal to the largest number of our visitors. We co-organize increasingly with community groups, listening and learning from them, and as a result our festivals have become spectacularly successful. A single example would be the Lunar New Year, where we had 15,000 people who came to the museum. I could also talk about our newly debuted, and I'm very proud to say, award-winning website. We just went up live about 9 or 10 months ago. It departs, I would deign to say radically, from traditional museum websites. It's not a vitrine. It's not a marketing tool that entices visitors to the museum, although of course we're very happy if it can attract visitors to the museum. It is a destination itself. It accumulates, it assembles, it gathers all of the resources that we have. It is, in that sense, we have 2 sets of galleries, physical galleries. In that sense, it's a 3rd gallery. So I could talk about all of those initiatives, but because I will be disciplined by a moderator, I will not. Let me start with a few other examples, and what better place to start than in China, as the museum's partnership with China span a century. Just this past month, we closed a major exhibition that was a key element of our centennial celebrations, Anyang, China's ancient city of kings. The exhibition was the culmination of years of research and years of relationships fostered with our colleagues here in China. And the exhibition and its related symposium very much embody the museum's commitment both to scholarly excellence and collaboration. Anyang was the first exhibition in the United States dedicated to the Shan capital. As you will all know, the source of China's earliest surviving written records and the birthplace of Chinese archaeology. In fact, in that birth of Chinese archaeology, we feel very privileged, our museum, to have participated. The Freer sponsored 2 seasons of Academia Sinica's Anyang excavations in 1929. These were the first seasons directed by Li Ji, whose archaeological work in China was funded by our museum from 1925 to 1930. Here it's important to note that we did not acquire anything from those excavations. All of the excavated objects remained in China. Now, this collaboration, predicated on the advancement of scientific knowledge and the protection of cultural patrimony, I really do think it marks an important chapter in the history of Sino-American relations, and part of the reason why we were so enthusiastic about putting on the Anyang show in 2023 was precisely to celebrate our two countries' long-standing collaborations. Now, 100 years after the Freer sponsored that work, collaboration endures. In fact, following this conference, I'll be traveling with my colleague to the site of the late Shang capital, and I'll be visiting the new archaeology museum that just opened 3 months ago, and I'm going there to discuss options for ongoing collaboration with its staff and field archaeologists. We'll also be visiting the Buddhist cave sites of Longmen and Shangtangshan to meet Chinese colleagues who are working on site reconstructions that take advantage of archival photographs and rubbings made during the lifetime of Mr. Freer. We also have a memorandum of understanding with the Palace Museum in Beijing, and one of the activities under which our relationship has been flourishing, we have the pleasure of hosting an associate research fellow, Li Guanhua, of the Palace Museum. Supported by the Baishantang Foundation, she's been working with our scientists on the study of materials in Chinese paintings and their deterioration. Another example. Several years ago, I'm moving towards a conclusion. We began a collaboration with Canon and the Kyoto Cultural Association. We aim to make high-definition facsimiles of some important Japanese paintings, which, for both legal and conservation reasons, could not travel and cannot be lent to other museums, to make those available. Through a powerful combination of printing technology and traditional crafts of mounting and curatorial and conservation expertise, 19 works were created, and this past November, put on display in the Kennenji Temple, Kyoto's oldest Zen temple. Another example, I'm a historian of early Islamic history. A couple of years ago, we began a partnership with the Qatar National Library. One aspect of that partnership is devoted to creating a series of 6 animations of automata, moving devices, illustrated in a 12th century manuscript by a Muslim polymath named Al-Jazari. Copied in multiple manuscripts, traveling across cultures, and now, thanks to this project, digitally animated, the illustrations speak to the age-old fascination with those self-operating devices and to forms of translation from image to text, from one language to another, and now from analog to digital. The animations will live permanently online. Other collaborations, getting at the point with which I began. We've been working closely now for almost 2 years with the Republic of Yemen government. The ambassador, that's Ambassador Hadrami, came to our museum and asked us to care for some 77 objects that had been looted in his war-torn country and repatriated legally to Yemen. We now have the pleasure of collaborating with the Yemeni government and looking after those pieces. They're really important in sandstone and alabaster, metal and parchment, and they document the extraordinary culture of Yemen, but at the same time, they speak to something immensely important, which is the circulation of looted antiquities. And our exhibition not only talks about Yemen in the first millennium, but very much addresses head-on some of the issues, including the responsibility that museums have for reducing the illegal trade in smuggled antiquities. A final example, I'll just give you a sense of the work that our museum is doing in provenance research and object histories. To my mind, there is no more promising field for museology in the 21st century than object histories and provenance research. We sponsor, as you can see, research, we organize seminars, we have global collaborators. Museums can be quite defensive in the West about provenance work, quite concerned that the more work they do in uncovering how the objects came into their possession, the more unwanted attention they will receive. That's not the case at our museum. We have been working hard to describe those object histories and to document our objects and to document our role insofar as we've had one. I conclude with two remarks, an observation and an undertaking. First, the observation. I'm very grateful to the organizers of the conference for this opportunity. It's my third visit to China in the last 6 months, and either the fifth or sixth visit I've made to East Asia since the end of COVID. Understanding the breadth and diversity of Asian civilizations, the generalizing rubric of the initiative that brings us all here together today, well, that too governs our museum's efforts. That's the observation. The undertaking is this. We are determined to make our second century as accomplished as our first, to become, as the title of my talk suggests, a global resource for a global community of museums. We go about this very ambitious project with humility, with a strong ethic of responsibility, mindful of our fallibility, and committed to collaboration. Thank you for your time.